where Jesus spent his final days, to Muslims as the site where the Prophet Muhammad rose to heaven, and to Jews as the capital of the first kingdom of Israel. This next hour is a journey through 19 centuries of Jerusalem's unique history, beginning with the destruction of the Second Temple.
Judea enslaved. Coins issued by the Romans proclaimed that the rebellious province of Judea was no more. But for many, an inextricable part of religious faith, and perhaps most so for the Jews, for whom Jerusalem was and is both a political capital and a primary focus of religious identity. That outer retaining wall of the Second Temple, still there after 2,000 years, is a potent spiritual symbol.
It is early morning now at the Western Wall, the retaining wall of the Second Temple, built 2,000 years ago. Around me, you can see why it is so often called the Wailing Wall. Each year, on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av, Jews gather here to mourn the destruction of the temple, the very center of their spiritual and national life.
A half-century after the temple fell in the year 70, Jewish nationalist believers tried to revolt against
Review 1-800-692-6. Superstar Connection 1-800-225-5772. For quality programming, order A&E. It's
hills outside Jerusalem. The Jews used this valley as a base of operations. The valley is now a Jewish sect within Roman Jerusalem managed to survive and grow, becoming a separate religion. The Christians followed what was both a moral philosophy and a practical guide to survival. As written in the New Testament, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Anthropologist Joe Zayas of Israel's Department of Antiquities was part of an archaeological team that discovered the first physical evidence of crucifixion, much as recorded in the New Testament.
In 1968, a colleague of mine, Vasilios Tsafiris, was excavating here in Jerusalem, and they ran into a Jewish tomb at a place called Givat HaMiftar. It was a tomb from the Second Temple period, around the time of Christ, and in the tomb were ossuaries, which was a common form of Jewish burial. And in one of the ossuaries were the remains of a young man who had been crucified. And until today, this has to be one of the most important finds, I think, in archaeology here in Jerusalem, because it's the only direct evidence we have in the world of crucifixion.
The new faith was nurtured in Jerusalem under harsh conditions. But Jesus' apostles took the new religion from Jerusalem to the world.
The first Christians, a Jewish sect who accepted Jesus as the Messiah, were persecuted by the Romans from the outset. But they were tenacious in their faith. Following the revelation to Paul on the road to Damascus, Christianity spread throughout Western Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean, culminating in the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine, who spread Christianity throughout the Roman Empire.
From the time that Constantine was converted, Jerusalem took on a new importance. In its first centuries, the early church thrived here, in caves like these, in the barren hills of Judea, where many Christians pursued their monastic faith, single-mindedly devoted to their religion and their God.
It was Constantine's mother, the Empress Helena, who came here to the hills around Jerusalem to find the relics and locations associated with the life of Jesus. She found innumerable Christian hermits living in caves such as this one, who had preserved over 300 years the oral tradition of every episode associated with Jesus' life. For the first time, a new Jerusalem, a Jerusalem of outsiders coming to recreate the spiritual life of the real city of the past, to pray at the sites associated with Jesus. Queen Helena searched the city to find the sites where the events of the Gospels had occurred. The most famous site Helena located is now the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. On a rock beneath its dome, Jesus was believed to have been crucified. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the holiest of all the Christian holy sites in Jerusalem. Hundreds of thousands of Christian visitors and pilgrims come here every year to worship and to pray. Behind this door lie the traditional sites of the crucifixion of Jesus, his burial, and his resurrection. The first church was built on this site by the Empress Helena in the 4th century. This magnificent facade was built by the Crusaders nearly 900 years ago. The choice of the site of the Holy Sepulchre was not mere speculation. Jesus was buried outside the city gates, according to the scriptures. Helena's choice of site fits the New Testament narrative and our knowledge of the city of those days. As this model built by Israeli archaeologists shows, the walls of Second Temple Jerusalem excluded Golgotha, the place of Jesus' execution, which lay on a hill outside the city. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is shared by different sects within Christianity. Inside the church labyrinth, Roman Catholic Franciscan fathers descend to a very sacred place.
Amen. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, hominis nostre, amen. Gloria Patri et Filio, et Spiritui Sancti nostre, amen. Gloria Patri et Filio, et Spiritui nostre.
Queen Helena made another discovery right here, in the cave beneath the Holy Sepulchre.
Gloria Patri et Filio, et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Gloria Patri et Filio, et Spiritus.
On this spot, inside this deep cave, Helena discovered a wooden cross. She was convinced that this was the cross on which Jesus had been crucified. Her conviction was strengthened because near it were remnants of 2 other crosses, those perhaps of the crosses on which the 2 thieves had been crucified next to Jesus. This discovery convinced Helena that all the other places she had found in Jerusalem were indeed the true places associated with the last days of Jesus on earth. Helena's quest continued in other parts of Jerusalem. Here, Helena located the tomb of the mother of Jesus. Later, the Crusaders built this magnificent church. While Helena's son Constantine was converting the pagans to Christianity, she was sending him discoveries and relics which gave the new Christians not only a spiritual but a physical center of their faith here in Jerusalem. As Helena continued to fit the pieces of the puzzle, she came to what was then a wooded valley on the outskirts of the city. Her stop here was another element building up the historic picture
of Jesus' last days in Jerusalem.
This ancient monastery was built on the site which the Empress Helena was told saw the tree cut down from which the cross was made on which Jesus was crucified. A tree, it was said, grown from a twig taken from the Garden of Eden, where it had been planted by Adam's son on Adam's grave. Thousands of pilgrims come here every year.
Helena's visit to Jerusalem provided Christianity with physical sites to underpin the biblical narrative and enrich the foundations of faith. When she had arrived, there were only hermits pursuing their singular faith in caves with intense dedication.
One can only speculate what would have happened if Helena hadn't been interested in coming here, hadn't been interested in finding these sites. These hermits would have lived and died with their many dramatic secrets undiscovered. And who knows, Jerusalem might have been without a single church, let alone so many hundreds of Christian monuments.
In one of Jerusalem's monasteries may lie the answer to a certain mystery, a mystery that continues to intrigue to this day.
When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, they took with them back to Rome the precious Jewish treasures of the temple. According to legend, a later Roman Christian general, Valerius, brought them back to Jerusalem and gave them for safekeeping to the monks of this ancient monastery. The monks, to make security doubly sure, buried the treasure. Then, when the Muslims came to Jerusalem, they murdered every one of the monks of this monastery. So the secret of where the Jewish treasure lies buried died with the monks, and no one to this day knows exactly where it is.
This History Channel special presentation will continue on A&E.
This is the desert, only a few miles east of Jerusalem. 300 years after Helena, another monotheistic religion was born in the deserts of Arabia, a religion that would reach Jerusalem and transform the city yet again. A new power was in the ascendant, Islam. Sweeping in from the desert in the 7th century, it created vast new empires. It was the Umayyad dynasty ruling from Damascus, which built this magnificent Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. For many years, the dome was a dull black, then anodized aluminium. And today, thanks to the munificence of King Hussein of Jordan, pure gold. The building of the Dome of the Rock was both a religious and political statement, a way of showing that Islam had perfected the earlier monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity. Here it was believed Muhammad, in a dream, ascended to heaven on his horse. This exquisite building was meant to demonstrate that the Temple Mount, and not the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was the central focus of religious life in Jerusalem. In the southern area of the Temple Mount, Muslim aristocrats used the stones of the Second Temple, hauled to the spot by King Herod's slaves hundreds of years before, to construct private dwellings and pleasure palaces, which are now being excavated. Since the Muslims believed their faith perfected that of earlier religions, they adopted the leading figures of Judaism and Christianity as their own. Abraham, Moses, Solomon, and Jesus became prophets within Islam. King David, a Jew, became known as Nebi Dawood, the Islamic prophet David. Though Jerusalem was called Al-Quds, the holy city, politically it took second place to more important cities in the Islamic world. But as Islam spread throughout the region, Jerusalem became the third holiest city in the Muslim religion, after Mecca and Medina. In Jerusalem's mosques, as in every mosque in the Muslim world, worshippers bow down in the direction of Mecca.
One could argue from a historical point of view that in a way we're lucky that no Islamic conqueror made Jerusalem his capital. Jerusalem was ruled from distant capitals, from Damascus, from Cairo, from Istanbul, with the result that a succession of letters, orders, directives are coming from these capitals to Jerusalem, instructing the local governor what to do, how to behave, how to deal with the local problem.
When a century after the Islamic conquest, the rule of the city was transferred from nearby Damascus to distant Baghdad, more than 1,000 miles away, the city began its slow decline. The first period of Muslim rule in Jerusalem lasted 460 years. But another dream was churning in far-off Europe. Christians longed for the city where their religion had been and dreamed of redeeming the Christian holy places from the infidel Muslims. And so from Europe, they approached Jerusalem.
The Crusaders had nearly 100 years here in Jerusalem. Many died here, but many more died on their way here. And Richard the Lionheart, King of England, was the unluckiest of all in that he came within sight of the city and yet was never able to enter its portals. It was left to his successors to conquer it.
Richard the Lionheart came up to here, within view of the holy city, to one of the sites shared by Jews and Muslims as a holy place. This is traditionally the tomb of Samuel, the visionary prophet who anointed the first king of Israel. Like Moses, who had only glimpsed but never entered the Holy Land, Richard the Lionheart came within sight of his holy grail, but was stopped here. Soon, inside the city, the Crusaders claimed what they considered theirs, including the Temple Mount, and bloodily slaughtered the Muslim infidels who stood in their way. The Jews in the city were either murdered, ransomed, or sold into slavery in Europe. Christian Arab tribes from east of the river were brought in to replace them. They reclaimed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which had fallen into disrepair, and refashioned it according to their own designs. The Crusaders carved a new chapter in Jerusalem's history, literally, leaving their own reverential graffiti on the walls of the Holy Sepulchre.
When the Crusaders came to Jerusalem, 800 years after Helena discovered the true cross, in a cave underneath this chapel, in their exuberance, they carved the Crusader cross on all the walls.
One of the churches built by the Crusaders was St. Anne, next to the Temple Mount, on top of the Pool of Bethesda. The pool was a water source for the Israelites during temple days. Here Jesus healed the blind and the sick.
After 460 years of Muslim rule, the Crusaders conquered Jerusalem. 800 years ago, they built this church on the site of what was believed to be the birthplace of the Virgin Mary. When Saladin's Muslim armies approached the city, the nuns here cut off their noses in the hope of preserving their virtue. Saladin built a religious school here. 130 years ago, the Ottoman Sultan sold the site to the Emperor Napoleon III of France. Since then, it has been tended by the French White Fathers.
The Crusaders built castles throughout the Holy Land. After just less than 100 years of rule, the Crusader kingdom was challenged and Crusader Jerusalem's days were numbered. The Muslims, led by Saladin, wrested Jerusalem and the rest of the country from Christian hands. The decisive battle to restore Muslim supremacy took place at the Horns of Hittim, north of Jerusalem, near the Sea of Galilee. The Muslim commander was a man still venerated today by Muslims as one of their greatest leaders, Saladin.
For the Muslims of Jerusalem, Saladin was the greatest warrior since Muhammad. It was he who defeated the Crusaders, leading to 700 years of Muslim rule. But he was more than a warrior king. He was also a wise man, showing the judgment of Solomon. When a dispute arose about rainwater between Muslims and Christians, it was Saladin who said, let a line be drawn across the roofs, and the water that flows to the left, let it go to the Muslims. The water that flows to the right, let it go to the Christians.
Soon, European maps of the period stressed the heavenly Jerusalem, partly because the earthly city was no longer in Christian hands. Muslim caliphs ruled from faraway Egypt and later from Ottoman Turkey. The Mamelukes, based in Egypt, built many buildings throughout Jerusalem, many that still survive today and form much of the essential structure of Jerusalem's old city. A careful eye can pick out beautiful facades going back to the 13th and 14th centuries.
Whereas in the Old Testament, Jerusalem is mentioned more than 600 times, it's actually not mentioned at all in the Quran. But we have here in Jerusalem, dating from the very first days of the Islamic conquest, we have superb buildings, starting with the Dome of the Rock and going on through the Mamluk and Ottoman period right up to modern times.
Throughout the centuries, Jerusalem was a city of tourism and pilgrimage. Many visitors came, among them the noted Rabbi Nachmanides, who had a synagogue named after him.
700 years ago, Nachmanides came to Jerusalem from Spain. He was struck by the utter desolation of the Jewish quarter, and in a moving letter to his sons, described the plight of Jerusalem.
What shall I say of this land? Great is its desolation. Jerusalem is the most desolate of all. Men flock from Damascus, Aleppo, and from all parts to Jerusalem to behold the place of the sanctuary and to mourn over it. May you, my son, and your brothers, and the whole of our family, see the salvation of Jerusalem.
A&E's special presentation of the History Channel will continue. Jerusalem, our guide, the historian and author, Martin Gilbert.
The last of the Muslim rulers of Jerusalem were the Ottoman Turks. By the time of Ottoman rule, the city was run down and desperately in need of renovation.
At the beginning of the 16th century, the Ottoman Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, came here to Jerusalem from Istanbul. He was shocked to discover the walls of the city in ruins, the city itself desolate. And so he began the rebuilding of the walls. His are the magnificent walls we see around Jerusalem today.
There was one curiosity in Suleiman's Jerusalem. The Jewish graveyard considered closest to heaven stood on the Mount of Olives, while directly under the city walls was another cemetery, one to transport Muslim souls to paradise. Above it were two gates, both impressively blocked to any visitor.
This magnificent double structure, the Golden Gate and the Gate of Mercy, was built by the first Muslim conquerors of Jerusalem in the 7th century. Jews believe that the Messiah will enter the Temple Mount through this gate. According to Christian tradition, Jesus entered here on Palm Sunday and will enter again at the second coming. In the 16th century, the Ottoman Turks closed the gate, fearful of the turbulence of Messianic Christianity. It has remained closed to this day. The current four quarters of Jerusalem's Old City took shape during Ottoman times. The Christian, Muslim, Armenian and Jewish quarters are representatives of aspects of the city's life today. Today's Muslim quarter was once a predominantly Jewish area. Today's Christian quarter included Muslims. Though only a small community of some 3,000 today, the Armenians are one of the most colorful and cultured of Jerusalem's peoples, with a distinctive history. The entire Armenian nation had become Christian by the 4th century. 800 years ago, the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, was established. Today it contains a magnificent library, a printing press, school, theological college, and at its center the superb cathedral church of St. James.
During the Ottoman Empire, it was forbidden to toll the bells. We were not allowed to ring the bells, you know, as we do now. So they have invented this to beat this wood, and you can hear it inside, all over the monastery, which is very big. So this is a tradition which is still kept.
One aspect of city life that has not changed very much through the centuries can be found in the Old City, where traders bring their goods from surrounding areas and commerce proceeds at a lively pace. This taste for commerce seemingly surmounts any religious or ethnic differences that may divide the city's people. The center of the old city of Jerusalem is the bazaar, or shuk. The four quarters come together here: the Jewish, the Armenian, the Christian, and the Muslim. This shuk rivals those of Damascus, Cairo, and Istanbul. The key in the shuk is to bargain. One is always offered a special price. I must try to get a special price. I'm interested in buying some sandals. Where are your sandals? Here. How much is that excellent pair there? In the 19th century, while the city was still in Ottoman hands, the West rediscovered Jerusalem.
This History Channel special presentation will continue on A&E, Jerusalem with Martin Gilbert.
The very first travelers who came to Jerusalem and wrote about it came in the 4th century. But in the 19th century, travelers were coming every year from every land and of every religion. Travelers who each year, perhaps 3, 4, 5, 6 every year, wrote down their impressions in book form. Their books were published and widely read throughout the world. Travelers who looked to the past of Jerusalem, who wrote about the discoveries of ancient times. Travelers who wrote about the city as they found it, sometimes disappointed, sometimes inspired. And travelers who wrote of their visions of what Jerusalem could be. One of the places most popular for the European visitors was the Ecce Homo Arch, associated with the life of Jesus, though this particular structure was built by the Roman Emperor Hadrian some 100 years after Jesus. Some painted it,
Others, many others, photographed it. And it still looks today much as it did 100 or indeed 1900 years ago. From the very first days of photography, photographers came to Jerusalem to photograph the holy sites. This, the Ecce Homo arch. Once it was part of a magnificent triumphal arch built by the Emperor Hadrian. It was here that Pontius Pilate introduced Jesus, already crowned with thorns, to the crowd contemptuously. Ecce Homo, behold the man. As Jerusalem was rediscovered in the 19th century, there was a virtual explosion of writings, drawings, and photographs. One of the remarkable things about those who came to Jerusalem was how quickly the city imprinted itself upon their minds. Most of them only came for a few days. David Roberts, the great painter, was only here for less than 2 weeks, and yet his drawings of Jerusalem have circulated until this day as the most beautiful visions of the city. Francis Bedford, the British photographer, photographed this, the Damascus Gate, 130 years ago, when photography was still in its infancy. His pictures, like those of the other early photographers, became the postcards of their day, making the sights of Jerusalem familiar to hundreds of thousands of people who could never visit the city. This photograph is the work of Mendel Denz, a Russian Jew who immigrated to the Holy Land and later converted to Christianity. The photos were sold throughout the world, offering Christendom its first real views of the Holy City, including this exceptional panorama, pasted together from single photos. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Al-Aqsa Mosque look very much then as they do today. Expectations about Jerusalem and what it had to offer multiplied. Still today, by the side of the road, where cars speed up to Jerusalem, the remnants of an inn from a century ago are visible from the road. Though the journey to Jerusalem was arduous, pilgrimage increased. Throughout the 19th century, before the advent of the railway, travelers to Jerusalem by horse and carriage would leave the Mediterranean coast late in the afternoon to avoid the intense heat and spend the night here at this Jewish-owned hotel at the entrance to the gorge leading up to Jerusalem before proceeding very early the next morning to the city. Among those travelers who made the journey was the American writer Mark Twain, who was bitterly disappointed by the city as he found it. Mark Twain was typical of many who came to Jerusalem in the 19th century. They came with such high hopes. They expected to see some beautiful, perhaps even some spiritual city. And all they found was ruins and corruption, dust, greed, remoteness, and they went away disappointed and disillusioned. Rags, wretchedness, poverty and dirt, wrote Mark Twain. Those signs and symbols that indicate the presence of Muslim rule more surely than the crescent flag itself, abound. Jerusalem is mournful and dreary and lifeless. I would not desire to live here. If the city was not quite what the Western visitor would have hoped, many were determined to discover the truth of the city that once was. The archaeologists who came to Jerusalem often got permission from the Sultan in Istanbul to dig beneath the city's surface to find what lay below.
As the 19th century came to an end, European archaeologists searched Jerusalem for ancient sites. One of those which they discovered 80 years ago was the Pool of Bethesda, once a Hasmonean pool in which Jewish maidens, no doubt, had disported themselves outside the city walls. At the beginning of the 19th century, much of Jerusalem was empty and desolate. By the end of the 19th century, every European empire had built fine buildings here. This building was built by the Russian Tsar in the style of several imperial palaces in the Crimea for wealthy Russian pilgrims who wanted a comfortable, indeed a luxurious space from which to visit the holy sites.
The Austrian hospice, now in the middle of the crowded old city, was built in the 19th century near the traditional way of the Via Dolorosa to serve the imperial ambitions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was one less noticed aspect to the development of 19th century Jerusalem. Jews had never left their holy city, but now, during the 19th century, they began to come back to Jerusalem in ever-growing numbers, crowding into the Jewish quarter of the old city. In the 1860s, with their population bursting beyond the confines of the Jewish quarter, the Jews made their first forays outside the city walls. Encouraged by Britain's Sir Moses Montefiore, the Montefiore houses were built outside the old city, facing the citadel and the Jaffa Gate.
By 1845, Jews formed the majority of Jerusalem's inhabitants. As the city continued to grow, visitors flocked to it. This, the Kamenitz Hotel, built 130 years ago, was for many years the city's finest hotel. Among its guests was the great Baron Edmund de Rothschild, pioneer of Jewish settlements throughout Palestine. Theodor Herzl spent the night here in 1898, on his way to meet the Kaiser at the Jaffa Gate. The culmination of the European presence in Jerusalem in the 19th century came with the German Kaiser's visit in 1898. Kaiser Bill, as the British knew him, was determined to establish German influence throughout Asia, from here to China. The first ever breach in the Ottoman walls of the old city was made here at the Jaffa Gate to enable the Kaiser to enter the city on horseback. The Kaiser's entry into Jerusalem in 1898, here at the Jaffa Gate, was to mark the end of one era and the beginning of another. After 19 centuries, Jerusalem had become a provincial town in a great empire. All that was to change. Within 2 years of the Kaiser's visit, a new history was to begin, the dramatic story of Jerusalem in the 20th century.
In addition to the German Kaiser, there were many other royal visitors to Jerusalem in the 19th century. In 1881, Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria arrived with 9 carriages, 28 servants, 5 cooks, plus stores of French oysters and Russian caviar. The Holy City also began attracting eccentrics and fanatics from around the world, men and women who stood on street corners shouting prophecies. Even today, local hospitals treat hundreds of visitors each year for delusions, some claiming to be Mary Magdalene or the prophet Isaiah. Psychiatrists call the disorder Jerusalem syndrome, the result, they say, of being totally overwhelmed by the city and its religious symbols. When we return, Jerusalem moves into the tumultuous 20th century.
Our History Channel special presentation will return in a moment here on A&E. Returns to this special presentation of the History Channel with your host, Roger Mudd.
In 1953, the writer Aldous Huxley visited Jerusalem, which was then divided by barbed wire and minefields. Huxley called Jerusalem the slaughterhouse of the religions. Another visitor remarked that Jerusalem had witnessed more murder, rape, and plunder than any other place on earth. Our next hour tells the story of Jerusalem in the 20th century, a time of terrorist attacks, assassinations, and 3 full-scale wars. Jerusalem today is not large. It's about the size of Boston. But its religious significance has cast the city into the cauldron of politics, zealotry, and war. We return now to the History Channel special presentation of Jerusalem with Martin Gilbert here on A&E.
The story of Jerusalem in the 20th century is incredibly rich and filled with conflict. The city grew dramatically. It suffered 3 major wars. Each one brought changes in borders and government. Christians, Muslims, Jews, each expressed differing claims and relationships to the Holy City. Muslim claimants, many invoking Arab-Palestinian nationalism, attempted to establish their place. Christian groups of all sorts have laid varying claims to the city. This international group of Christians sees no place, what it calls Muslim infidels, who in its view for 13 centuries has usurped the site of the Holy Temple. To prepare the ground for the second coming of the Messiah, they would like to see the people of the Old Testament government, the Jews, assert their sovereignty.
This city over which we bind the spirit of Islam this day. This city over which we bind the demonic powers of hell that have been assigned against it. The city over which you have...
Modern Israelis have often tried to downplay the religious aspect of their attachment to the Holy City. But they feel it is the prime focus, both of Jewish religious identity and Jewish national feeling.
Anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem, to be one, to be under Israel's sovereignty and our capital forever.
The German Kaiser's visit in 1898 marked a new era for Jerusalem. Much of the publicity centered on Kaiser Wilhelm and his queen. No man would more influence Jerusalem's destiny in the 20th century than the Austro-Hungarian journalist and writer who came to the city especially to meet the German emperor.
Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, first saw Jerusalem from this spot. He was 38 years old. He had come to the city to try to persuade the German Kaiser to support a Jewish land company for Palestine. After his visit, Herzl set out his own vision for transforming the dusty alleyways of the city into a vibrant metropolis. Herzl's vision of Jerusalem was not quite the heavenly Jerusalem, but neither was it mired in the kind of religious faith that Herzl considered superstition. His ideal city was much more like modern Jerusalem, a city of the future, not only of the past. This scene in Jerusalem was filmed in 1903 by a camera crew sent from America by Thomas Edison. After centuries languishing under Ottoman Muslim rule, Jerusalem was a curious mixture of East and West, with a growing population and an economic base that could launch it into the 20th century. The aspect of the city that most struck many visitors was the smell. Jerusalem lacked a sewage system. This did not deter a growing number of Christian pilgrims and Jewish visitors. Jews arrived in the city from Europe and the Middle East, increasingly to live here and make it home. The Wailing Wall, the most sacred spot of Jewry, was located in a narrow alley. Above the wall was another impressive structure, the site of the Jewish temples, on which Muslim authorities built the Dome of the Rock in the 7th century. Jerusalem, though the third holiest city in Islam, was a remote city in the vast Ottoman Empire and ruled from distant Istanbul. The Turkish-built railroad station, completed in 1892, opened the city to trade and commerce from the coastal plain and from surrounding countries. When the 20th century dawned, Jerusalem had only been linked to the coast by rail for 8 years. This was the station then, and this is the station now. The city was a remote provincial town in the Ottoman Empire, but trade and commerce flourished. The train meandered slowly up from the coast, but it brought with it a great influx of goods and people. By the first years of the 20th century, neighborhoods had sprung up all around the city, quaint sections that the visitors can walk around today and enjoy. The most rapidly growing suburbs were the Jewish suburbs. These houses were built for Jewish immigrants before the First World War. By the beginning of the 20th century, Jews were reaching Jerusalem from all over the world, from as far away as India, the Yemen, Siberia, and even San Francisco. By 1914, the Jewish community of Jerusalem was 45,000 out of a total population of 70,000. It was a vibrant, lively community of writers, teachers, rabbis, painters, and poets.
A&E with Martin Gilbert.
In the century's first decade, the great European powers competed between themselves for influence. No power was more assiduous than Germany, led by Kaiser Wilhelm. Even today, we can see the results of the Kaiser's incredible efforts. Following the Kaiser's visit to Jerusalem in 1898, German building flourished. The Kaiser himself bought the land for this magnificent Church of the Dormition, built on the traditional site of the death of the Virgin Mary. The church took 12 years to build. By the time it was completed in 1910, the city was teeming with people. Christian pilgrims, Jewish immigrants, a growing Muslim population, European traders and missionaries, and above all, travelers writing innumerable books about the bustling, multifaceted city. At the city's highest point, the ridge separating the Judean desert on one side from the Mediterranean plain on the other, the Kaiser undertook another building, one that is still today under German Lutheran administration. It is known as the Augusta Victoria and is now a hospital serving the Arab population from the whole region.
The First World War would profoundly touch Jerusalem. German and Austrian soldiers filled the city streets as allies of the Turkish garrison. In 1915, an Arab nationalist group was charged with conspiracy against the Turks. The Turks were merciless, publicly hanging them outside the Jaffa Gate. The Jewish spy group operating for the British later met a similar fate. At the Wailing Wall, Jewish soldiers of the Austrian army, also allies of the Turks, came to watch and to pray. Changes impinged on Jerusalem at war. The German general, von Falkenhayn, arrived in the city and vigorously engaged in training Turkish forces to make a stand against the British. The British recruited Jewish and also Arab forces to help them. The British twice attempted to approach Jerusalem by the seashore and Gaza. 2 devastating battles ensued at a shockingly high cost to the Allies. Thousands were killed in battle. Many British troops were captured. With the British defeats outside Gaza, a new British commander was appointed to try to drive the Turks from Jerusalem. His name, General Edmund Allenby. Allenby trained his mobile forces for a surprise attack via Beersheba, the Negev desert. One ingenious stratagem was to parachute hashish and opium to the Turkish troops to try to keep their minds off the fighting. Allenby's strategy worked brilliantly. The Turkish and German officers and officials prepared for their departure from Jerusalem. The city's mayor led a delegation to surrender to the British. 2 British sergeants accepted the Turkish surrender to what a fellow soldier called the keys of the citadel of Christendom. The place where Allenby's soldiers accepted the white flag of surrender is today memorialized by a square and monument in the western part of the city. This seldom visited corner is known as Allenby Square. Here, Allenby took the surrender of Jerusalem. This gruff, overbearing soldier had at last come into his own. The capture of Jerusalem made newspaper headlines throughout the world. The holy city was in Christian hands for the first time since the Crusades 700 years before. Church bells chimed the Allied victory throughout the Western world, with the exception of Germany. The Allied troops marched into the city feeling very much that they were following in the tradition of the Crusades. They came along the Jaffa Road and through the same gate the Kaiser had entered 19 years earlier. Allenby made a point of walking into the city. He did not want extraneous comparisons either with the Kaiser or, for that matter, with Jesus, who had entered the city on a donkey. Flanked by a French and an Italian general representing the Allies, Allenby established martial law and civil order and offered his personal greetings to the leaders of all the city's communities. Memories of the First World War still persist in Jerusalem, the most poignant at the British War Cemetery on Mount Scopus, next to the Hadassah Hospital and the Hebrew University. Thousands of soldiers have been killed in the battle for Jerusalem in 1917. Among the British soldiers who are buried here are some who had fought on all the war fronts since the start of the war in 1914. Many died here who came from as far away as Australia and New Zealand. There are Muslim soldiers from India and Jewish soldiers from Britain and the United States. Jerusalem had been conquered, but the cost had been high. administration came to Jerusalem. The League of Nations authorized a British mandate in all of Palestine. The end of war ceremonies marked a new day for the Holy City. Energetic from the outset, the British provided food, a stable currency, drainage, and revitalized the ancient water system, initially built 19 centuries earlier by Pontius Pilate.
At the beginning of the 19th century, much of Jerusalem was empty and desolate. By the end of the 19th century, every European empire had built fine buildings here. In 1918, 3 of those empires, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Turkish, had been destroyed in war. They dissolved. Their buildings were taken over by the British mandate and form today an integral part of modern Jerusalem.
Some months after the British victory, General Allenby celebrated American Independence Day on July the 4th at the American colony. The city's tiny but vigorous American community thoroughly welcomed the change from Turkish to British rule. From as early as 1920, Arabs and Jews increasingly immigrated to the city. Arab and Jewish demonstrations intensified, with the British caught in the middle. Jewish and Arab nationalism both flourished in Jerusalem. The Jews had been promised a Jewish national home by the British. The Arabs wanted independence. The annual Muslim march to Nebi Musa in the Judean desert became an expression of Arab national feeling.
The arrival of the British in Jerusalem stimulated Jewish national aspirations. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 had offered a Jewish national home throughout Palestine. And so here in Jerusalem, Jewish activity flourished. Arab nationalism was also aroused, leading to frequent clashes throughout the city. Nowhere more so than here in Zion Square, the center of Jewish Jerusalem. In 1921, Winston Churchill, then the British colonial secretary, visited the city, listening to the arguments on both sides of the Arab-Jewish divide. Churchill was blunt in addressing the Arabs, telling them that they must welcome the Jews, who would bring prosperity to both communities.
British rule plus Jewish immigration brought a new dynamism to the city. Jerusalem in the 1920s experienced vast building efforts, rising prosperity, and economic growth. Attracted by new opportunities, Arab immigration into the city increased as well. Though there were occasional Arab protests of the growing Jewish presence, the entire city shared in the new prosperity. The single event that most symbolized Jewish hopes took place at this amphitheater on Mount Scopus, with its commanding view of the Judean desert. The opening of the Hebrew University in 1925 was the culmination of a Zionist dream. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim leaders gathered at the edge of the Judean desert to celebrate the opening of a center of learning and excellence. The leader of the Palestinian Arabs from the 1920s was the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini. Though his community was expanding and experiencing unparalleled prosperity, the Mufti feared that local Arabs would be deprived of the possibility of political control of the city and country.
The Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, was deeply opposed to Jewish immigration. 3 times in 1921, 1929, and 1936, he created riots here which led to great loss of life and deeply exacerbated the relationship between Jews and Arabs.
In 1929, Arab resentment rose to the surface, and what was to become known as the Arab disturbances broke out. The demonstrations became riots that led to the murder of Jews and the destruction of much Jewish property in and around Jerusalem. Even Jews who were the most idealistic believers in peace and coexistence between the two communities were attacked.
In this house, Professor Levi Billig, one of the great Jewish advocates of Jewish-Arab reconciliation, was murdered at his desk. With growing Arab violence, it was a cruel time for Jerusalem. Here is a police photograph of Professor Billig's blood. He was killed while editing a medieval Muslim manuscript. Jerusalem was essentially a small city in the Middle East, not a vast metropolis. It was part of the British Empire, but not its center. And then with the rise of Hitler in Germany in 1933, an enormous influx of German Jewish refugees came here, and together with Polish Jews, also refugees from persecution and privation, they made a tremendous contribution to the institutions of the city and to its vibrant Jewish life. Arab resentment of the continuing Jewish immigration had broken out again into riots in 1936. The British felt it imperative to calm the situation. Officials felt that the long-range answer to the city's problems lay in a political solution, a compromise. A royal commission, headed by Lord Peel, was sent to Jerusalem to propose a solution. In 1937, as the riots continued throughout Palestine, British officials met here at the Palace Hotel, built 8 years earlier by the Muslim Religious Foundation, to take evidence from Jews and Arabs alike about what should be done. After long deliberation, the officials came up with an answer: partition, a Jewish state and an Arab state. But they also decided that Jerusalem, with its mixed Jewish and Arab population, should remain under British rule. The Jews were ready to accept the Peel Commissioner's recommendation. The Arabs rejected any compromise at all. Under further Arab pressure, the British agreed to curb Jewish immigration. The Arabs were delighted. The Jews marched in protest. Then, in September 1939, war broke out in Europe. Britain's own survival was threatened. With the